Hello, everyone, and welcome to our State of the Wildlife webinar. It's really wonderful to see everyone here today, and I am Angela Grimes, the CEO of Born Free USA, and I just want to welcome you to our discussion of what is going to be a talk on the state of wildlife in today's world and what Born Free USA will be doing to take on the challenges and make the world a safer place for animals, people, and nature in general. For those of you just getting to know us, Born Free was founded by Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers, stars of the iconic film Born Free, along with their son, Will Travers. What started around a kitchen table many years ago with just a few dollars or pounds has grown into a global organization with programs in numerous countries on 5 continents. We believe that wild animals belong in the wild, and we're seeking a future in which humans no longer exploit wildlife. We're fighting to end a number of threats that affect not only entire species, but also individual lives. Some of these threats are wildlife trafficking, trapping, fur, the exotic pet trade, and animals exploited in industries such as zoos and traveling shows. We also rescue and care for animals in our sanctuaries around the world, including our primate sanctuary in Texas, which is home to more than 400 monkeys, many of whom were rescued from research labs, private homes, and zoos. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what we're doing. And if you'd like to learn more about our programs, please visit bornfreeusa.org. And while you're there, I'd like to also ask you to make a contribution. We are running our membership drive right now, and we would appreciate it if you would renew your membership or become a new member in 2021. The more members we have, the greater our impact. And whether that's $10, $20, or $100 or more, gifts of every size help us continue our work to save the natural world. Today, we have a very impressive panel of experts. We have Dr. Liz Tyson, Born Free USA's Programs Director, Jennifer Place, Director of Government Affairs for Pike Associates, Elise Stroud, Born Free USA's Africa Policy and Capacity Building Director, and Will Travers, co-founder and president of Born Free. We're also honored to have Virginia McKenna listening in there in the UK at home with Will. I'd like to invite you to use the Q&A or chat function to post your questions throughout the program. We will take time to answer questions following each speaker rather than holding to the end. And if you have any burning questions now or would just like to say hello to the panelists, please feel free to type in your thoughts now or at any time. So on with the show, as they say. Up first is Dr. Liz Tyson, our programs director. Liz lives at the Primate Sanctuary in Texas and manages all of our U.S. wildlife programs. She's helped animals across the globe, and a few of her impressive accomplishments include helping to establish the very first locally run sterilization program for street dogs in the Middle East, working with indigenous communities in the Colombian Amazon to end the hunting of wild primates, and running a UK charity campaigning to end the exploitation of animals in circuses and zoos. Liz, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone who's joined us. I'm really excited to see everyone here today. I just want to warn you in advance, my internet is being a little bit sketchy today, so I'm hoping I'm going to be able to stay on the whole time. If not, then we might have to jump to another speaker quickly and come back to me. So forgive me if I disappear briefly. So Born Free USA is proud to operate one of the largest primate sanctuaries in the United States, based on a 175-acre site here in South Texas, where I'm talking to you from today. We provide, as Angela said, home to over 400 monkeys who came to us from traumatic backgrounds, including the pet trade, from zoos, and from animal experimentation. I think we can all agree that 2020 was a challenge in more ways than one. For us, while the supply of some of our daily use items, such as PPE, became hard to come by, and prices for these and some of our fresh food products skyrocketed, life here at the sanctuary otherwise didn't change much, despite the global pandemic. The monkeys care little for the goings-on of the outside world and still require round-the-clock care 365 days a year from our expert team. The 5 monkeys for who the world did change last year were our new arrivals, macaques, Mrs. Wilkin and Anna, and baboons, Marlin, Violet, and Presley. They arrived just before COVID took hold. They came from a terrible roadside zoo, which was closed down following a lengthy and complex legal battle fought by the Animal Legal Defence Fund, ALDF. ALDF wanted the 5 monkeys to go to a place where they knew they would be properly looked after for the rest of their lives, and we were delighted.
Well, it appears, as Liz had predicted, that we have lost her internet, which is a shame. Hopefully she'll be back on very shortly and can continue telling you about the primate sanctuary, these wonderful monkeys who are all doing very well right now, along with our plans for upcoming campaigns in 2021. I'm going to switch to Jen Place. She is a part of our team, and Jennifer is the Director of Government Relations for Pike Associates. Pike Associates is a boutique government relations firm located in DC. She works with Born Free USA on our legislative and regulatory matters before Congress and the administration, which supports and advances many of the issues that Liz will discuss, and supports our work to not only change minds and advocate for the animals, but to change laws and policies to make a real and lasting difference. Throughout Jen's more than 10 years of professional experience, she's worked on the conservation of endangered species, the protecting of both marine and terrestrial wildlife from cruel practices in the US and abroad, and she's defended bedrock conservation laws like the all-important Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act. Welcome, Jen, and I'd also like to say happy yesterday birthday.
Thank you so much, Angela, and sorry, Liz, for your internet issues. I suppose living on a sanctuary certainly comes with its everyday adventures. I'll go ahead and get us started on our policy agenda. We will be a little out of order, so note that I'll flag some things that Liz will circle back to when she takes the helm again. I want to start out by talking about the new congressional session. On January 3rd of this year, the US Congress gavelled in a new 2-year congressional session, the 117th Congress, drawing the previous congressional session to a close. Part of what this means is that at the end of 2020, any of the bills that had not passed expired and will now have to be reintroduced. Knowing that we would have this fresh political landscape, we began work in late 2020 to develop a policy agenda to parallel and complement Born Free's campaign work, which Liz will get into in just a little bit. This policy agenda has continued to take shape as we've learned more about the political landscape for this year. As you know, we have a new administration under President Biden and Vice President Harris. Sorry, this is Harriet, everybody. Sorry about that. Develop a policy agenda under President Biden and Vice President Harris. We also have a House and Senate that is now controlled both by the Democrat Party, but by slim margins. It's actually the slimmest of margins in the Senate, a 50-50 split with Vice President Harris as a tiebreaker. So even though we're still in the early days of this Congress, it's clear that bipartisanship is still a very important goal for our issue areas. However, under this new Congress, new presidential administration, and new cabinet, we're gearing up to be proactive and not just reactive. So instead of just focusing on fixing the bad, we plan to work with our wildlife and environmental champions in Congress and the administration to implement new policies that help wild animals, the environment, and the public. So go ahead, next slide, please. So I'm gonna start getting into our policy priority areas. The first is trapping and fur farms. You'll hear from Liz a little bit later about trapping and fur farms in the United States. I'm just gonna go ahead and get right into our priority bills. The first of which is the Refuge from Cruel Trapping Act. This bill would ban all body gripping traps, including leg hold traps, conibear body gripping traps, and snares throughout the National Wildlife Refuge system. You can see on this map on the slide here, these are all the national wildlife refuges that allow trapping, about 40% of the entire National Wildlife Refuge system. So you can see just based on that map what a big problem this is. The second bill is the Limiting Inhumane Federal Trapping Act, or the LIFT Act. This is a bill that is more expansive than the first bill. It would ban all trapping on all lands managed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. It would also ban USDA and Interior employees and contractors from using traps in the line of duty. The third is the Public Safety and Wildlife Protection Act. This is a bill that would commerce of the two most widely used traps in the US, leg hold traps and the conibear body gripping traps. None of these three bills have been reintroduced yet this Congress, but we're working closely with our congressional champions on a reintroduction strategy. And I'll just go ahead and tell you now, this is not the first time you'll hear me say that, since we're so early on in the new congressional session. I also want to chat briefly about a new policy area we're developing on fur farming. We're exploring ways to curtail fur farms, especially during this global pandemic and the known link between mink fur farms and the COVID-19 virus. Next slide, please. The next policy area is captive exotic animals. I'm going to start with the Big Cat Public Safety Act. This bill had a very big year last year. Due in part to highly increased national attention, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, the Big Cat Public Safety Act passed the House last December by a very respectable vote of 272 to 114. You can see on this little image on your screen that it was a bipartisan vote. All those little blocks that are filled in are the yes votes. Unfortunately, that late in the year, there was just not enough time in the Senate to take up the bill, so it expired with the start of the 117th congressional session. However, with the national spotlight this issue is still getting, along with the strong House vote, we're hoping to continue to build off the momentum of last year and get this bill passed and enacted quickly. We think 2021 is our year. To that end, this is the first of our priority bills that has already been reintroduced in the House with solid bipartisan support. You can see the bill number there, HR 263. I also want to touch on the Captive Primate Safety Act, which would ban the interstate or foreign sale of non-human primates, specifically for the exotic pet trade. This is a priority bill for Born Free and our coalition partners, and we are currently strategizing with our champions in the House and Senate on how to approach this bill and when to reintroduce, but we think it'll be soon. Lastly, we're working on a new policy area. We're looking at ways to stop the importation of wild-caught primates for use in animal testing. This is an issue that is just devastating for the welfare of these wild-caught primates and a serious cause for concern for their conservation status in the wild. Many of these primate species are either threatened or endangered in the wild. And we also cannot ignore the public health implications of this practice as we continue to struggle with the ongoing pandemic brought about by a zoonotic disease. Next slide, please. The next policy priority issue area is trophy hunting. There were two bills from last Congress, actually the past several Congresses, that Born Free strongly supported, the Cecil Act and the Protect Act. The Cecil Act was specifically targeted at actions taken under the Trump administration, shrouding the trophy import permit process in secrecy, allowing lion and elephant trophy imports from countries with poor or non-existent conservation plans, and more. The Protect Act sought to prohibit the import of any trophy of an endangered or threatened species, or a species that was a candidate under the Endangered Species Act to become a threatened or endangered species. These issues are still a top priority for Born Free, but under the Biden administration, we think that legislation may not be the most effective way to address them. We're working with the House Natural Resources Committee and the Fish and Wildlife Service under President Biden to see what can be undertaken through the agency. Next slide, please. We're also continuing to focus on some regulations that were enacted under the Trump administration that weakened the Endangered Species Act. Last Congress, we supported a bill called the Paw and Fin Conservation Act. This bill simply would have repealed those regulations. Much like the trophy hunting issues that we're looking into, we're working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the relevant House and Senate committees to see what options we have now, not just for undoing the bad, but for possible ways that we can make the ESA an even stronger law. We are also continuing to monitor any bad bills that pop up either in the House and Senate or bad initiatives undertaken through the Biden administration. We're continuing to work within coalitions and through the appropriations process to secure funding for important Fish and Wildlife Service programs, endangered species, and more. And while not necessarily top priorities, I did want to note that Born Free USA supports a number of other wildlife bills and policy areas pertaining to the protection of the North Atlantic right whale, migratory birds, amphibians, sharks, pollinators, and much more. We also support efforts restricting wildlife killing contests, the use of toxic lead ammo and tackle, and the use of poisons. So I'll wrap up by saying, as I mentioned earlier, Born Free's strategy is to be proactive and progressive in our approach. But we're not the only group thinking along these lines. And as we can already see, the Biden administration has come out of the gate with a bold and full policy agenda. As the House and Senate continue to get organized and up and running, we can also expect the same from them. In other words, we're facing a noisy, crowded arena with countless priorities. We'll need your help and your voice to make sure our issues continue to be heard in DC. I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jen. That was great. You've got your work cut out for you. So one question that I'd like to put to you is, how does Born Free, and I guess, myself included in that, how do we make the decisions about which bills we want to work on? How do we establish our priorities, and what sort of factors play into that, your reasoning in that decision-making process?
Sure. I would say there are quite a few factors that go into that decision-making process, and it ends up being a bit of a balancing act. We look at, through our strategy sessions and conversations within the Born Free team, with other organizations, and with congressional offices that champion wildlife issues. We have these strategy conversations on what is needed, what there is political appetite for, and where Born Free can play a substantial role. So take trapping, for example. Born Free is one of the few US organizations focused and has been focused for decades now on reforming and limiting the scope of trapping in the United States. So that's really an issue area for us, and one that we can continue to promote on Capitol Hill. But it is one of the issue areas that has yet to receive strong bipartisan support. That is a bill that has always been championed by Democrats. The captive exotic issue areas and the exotic pet trade, however, that is something where there is political appetite for on both sides of the aisle. The Big Cat Public Safety Act in its first iteration was introduced by a Republican from California. So these are the things that we look at, what there is a role for, what's needed, and the political appetite on Capitol Hill.
Great, thank you. And we have Liz back. Jen, if you'll stay around after Liz's section, we may want to bring you back in for more questions. So
I will not go anywhere. Thank you.
Welcome back, Liz.
Hi. Hopefully I'll stay on this time. Ironically, I got back on about after Jen started talking and it stayed on, so I hope that wasn't my 10-minute window. But let's see how we go. Karen, if you could move it forward to the next slide. So I think I left you on the cliffhanger of when Mrs. Wilkin and Anna arrived at the sanctuary. They arrived just before COVID took hold and came to us from a terrible roadside zoo, which was closed down thanks to a complex and hugely successful legal case led by the Animal Legal Defence Fund, the ALDF. The ALDF wanted the 5 to go to a forever home where they could be properly cared for, and we were delighted that they chose us for that task. So Mrs. Wilkin and Anna arrived in January. Mrs. Wilkin is advanced in years and posed some worries for us before we met her. On paper, she had a series of serious health conditions, including arthritis, undiagnosed tumours, bone deformities, and an old, poorly healed fracture in her jaw, which prevents her from closing her mouth properly, as you can see from these pictures. Honestly, we had genuine concerns that this frail, elderly little monkey might not even survive the journey to us. Boy, were we wrong. In the first few moments of her arriving, we gave her some water. As you could see us preparing her food in the meantime, apparently we were not moving quickly enough for Mrs. Wilkin. So in her fury, she threw her water at us and demanded the food by putting her arms through and kind of trying to grab it off. As you can see in that photograph there on the left, there's an upturned water bowl. That was what soaked us as we were trying to get her food to her. Anna, her more docile best friend, follows Mrs. Wilkin's lead as the pair enjoy their spacious new home. Mrs. Wilkin is feisty. She knows exactly what she wants and she lives every day to the full. She really did prove us wrong from those initial concerns. Now, we're honest that Mrs. Wilkin is in end-of-life care. She may be with us for a few more weeks. She may be with us for a few more months, or honestly, knowing her, she might just outlive us all. But she's a reminder that even the most compromised of monkeys can still be given a second chance and take full advantage of that second chance after rescue. The 3 baboons, who we later found out to be father and daughters, Marlin, Violet, and Presley, arrived a few months later in March. You can see here from these pictures the horrible, squalid conditions they were kept in before. But they're settling in really, really well as they come up for their year anniversary. They were released into their large, open-top, beautiful enclosure where they could run, they could climb, they could forage for the very first time in their lives. I was talking to our vet this morning about Marlin, and she said he's just the absolute perfect body condition. He's so beautiful, and they really are thriving. It took them a little while to get used to their neighbours. One of their neighbours, Darwin, threw rocks at them, literally, for the first week or so, until he realised that they could actually be good friends, and now they spend time grooming through the fence with their neighbours, Darwin and Caleb. Now, right now at the sanctuary, we're at capacity. One way in which COVID has impacted us is that grant-giving organisations have, understandably, diverted funds towards human health. That's delayed a significant number of construction projects that we had, which would create more space to rescue more monkeys. It means that right now we can't currently save monkeys who need us. We're hoping that that situation will become easier in the coming year, and so our plan is to seek funding to build new enclosures, actively start rescuing again, and hopefully give a second chance to monkeys like Mrs. Wilkin, Anna, Marlin, Violet, and Presley in the coming year. But the problems facing wildlife, some of which Jen talked about in her section, both monkeys and other animals, can't be fixed by rescue work alone. And I think that's one thing that makes Born Free USA really special. And it's the reason that I'm very proud to work for this organisation, is that we work across the whole spectrum, tackling the symptoms and the root cause of our core issues. And that's why our work doesn't just consist of rescue and care, but also encompasses a broad campaign strategy, which includes public awareness and political and legislative efforts that Jen has so ably explained to us to bring an end to the cruel practices which land animals on our doorstep in the first place and continue to impact the welfare of a broad range of native and non-native animals across the US and abroad. So Jen's talked a little bit about trapping and what we're doing from a lobbying perspective. Why is that such an important issue? Well, in September of last year, we launched our Trap Free Trails campaign, calling upon the Department of Interior to prohibit trapping on national wildlife refuges. Now, believe it or not, in federal wildlife refuges encompassing 11.1 million acres of land, places where animals are supposed to be protected, trapping is permitted. It means that native wildlife is at risk from these cruel and indiscriminate contraptions, along with companion animals visiting these spaces with their human families. Now, our campaign gained over 10,000 signatures, petition signatures in a month. And now that the new Congress is in session, as Jen talked about, we'll be pursuing this issue at a federal level on a number of different fronts. As a continuation of this campaign and our long-term efforts on the issue, we're in the final stages of collating and analysing regulatory information around trapping across the US. It will update and extend work that we've done before to provide the most detailed understanding of the way in which trapping is carried out, monitored and regulated in the US. And we'll use this data as a basis for targeted state-level lobbying to complement the work we're doing at federal level. We plan to release this new report and detail our accompanying campaign strategy in the spring. Then in November of last year, we released the most comprehensive review of fur farming regulation carried out in the US in over a decade. The timing of the release could not have been more pertinent, as Jen has touched upon. By pure coincidence, it coincided with the outbreak of COVID-19 in mink fur farms in Europe, and then very quickly we saw outbreaks in Utah, Wisconsin, and then Michigan. Officials played it down and claimed that there was no real risk for COVID spreading from mink to humans. But this flew in the face of anecdotal data and also later peer-reviewed reports, which date back to May last year, which show that actually, yes, there is a risk of transmission from mink to humans. And what this issue really highlights is that while our initial concern and primary goal in targeting fur farming is, of course, animal welfare and protecting animals from this undeniably cruel practice, we can't ignore the risk to public health and safety. And in all honesty, the risk to public health and safety may give us more traction and leverage than speaking from an animal welfare perspective alone. Put bluntly, where authorities might not consider banning in the interest of animals, they might be more open to banning if there's genuine concern for human health. So with that in mind, as Jen's touched upon, we're beginning to explore policy options at the federal level. It is very early days, but we hope to be able to update on that strategy soon. And then again, as Jen has talked about, we cover a great number of different issues at Born Free. In addition to trapping and fur farming, which will be a major focus of our work in 2021 on a number of different planes, we'll be moving forward with other campaigns to protect and strengthen the Endangered Species Act, arguably the most important piece of wildlife legislation we have here in the US. We'll be continuing to combat the cruel exotic pet trade, including the trade in primates as pets, whose existence fuels the need for our sanctuary work and which causes suffering to millions of animals around the nation. And we'll be going back to our roots to really strengthen our work on the issue upon which Born Free was founded in the 1980s, and that's the keeping of wild animals captive in zoos. And as ever, we can do none of this without you. For our sanctuary work and campaign efforts, your support is absolutely essential, whether that's adopting a monkey, supporting a funding campaign for a new enclosure, contacting your representative to ask them to take action on a new legislative measure. We're all in this together, and I'm really, really excited about what 2021 has to hold and work we're going to do together to seek even more progress for animals. Thank you.
Hi, Liz. We're so glad you were able to make it back and do that.
I was watching my watch and hoping it wasn't going to disappear again. So
good, good. Well, I have a question for you. Tracy has written, 2020 has seen a growing awareness of racism, colonialism, and other forms of social injustice. I'm wondering how you see your mission connecting to other social justice issues that are so important today, and how are wild animals connected to these matters or these injustices?
Wow, that's a great question. Wow, well, I think realistically, we can't look at any one single issue, whether that is wildlife, whether that's race, whether that's gender, as a standalone issue. So the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, which has been used in various different areas now, initially looked at what we refer to as intersectionality, which looks at kind of the crossing over and the interaction between different forms of oppression. Now it is kind of founded in critical race theory and gender theory, but really what it's talking about is how systems of oppression can't exist independently of one another. So for example, when we talk about habitat destruction in a range state, then there are people involved in that as well. There's geopolitics involved in that. So our plans cannot just be us sitting here in Born Free USA in our office in Washington, kind of coming up with ideas for conservation efforts over there where destruction is happening. We need to look at supply and demand. Most of the demand for for the products that come out of those range states are demanded by the global West, and therefore we are the ones causing the destruction. We need to engage with local communities. We need to ensure that those local communities are playing active leadership roles in any of our projects, because otherwise, the projects will not be successful, but also it would be doing a huge disservice to the various actors involved in these really important issues. So I think we need to take a really holistic approach. I think Will is going to talk about that a little bit in his section as well. So it's something that we always try to bear in mind when we're working on our campaigns, for sure, and we try and integrate as much of that thinking as we can. And we're always open to, if ever anybody feels that we haven't hit that mark correctly, we are always open to feedback on those issues and working with other groups and other people to improve. We can always improve, of course.
Great, thank you, Liz. Jen, if you're there, I'd like to invite you back for one quick question before we move on to our next presenter. And that is, can you talk a little bit about the other groups that we work with? I know we partner with others. Somebody asked if we partner with other organizations? Yes, we do. But I thought you might want to talk a little bit about what that looks like and who they are.
Absolutely. So, wow, where to start? There are a number of organizational coalitions that Born Free is a part of and plays a role in. These coalitions are comprised of sometimes just a few other NGOs or charities or many. One of the largest coalitions that Born Free is a part of is the Endangered Species Act legislative coalition that was first formed many years ago to defend the ESA against congressional legislative attacks. So just brief history, bear with me. In 2011, a policy rider was attached to the appropriations bill for that year that delisted gray wolves in certain states, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. And that policy rider made it through and unfortunately started a precedent that then unleashed this avalanche of harmful policy riders that weakened the ESA, that legislatively delisted species, bypassing completely the science-based management approach of the agency and what's outlined by law under the Endangered Species Act. So that is a coalition where many groups can find common ground and combine priorities. The Trapping Coalition, however, is quite a bit smaller, but no less mighty. It's Born Free. And our primary partner on this issue is the Animal Welfare Institute, which tends to be in lockstep with Born Free on the majority of our policy areas. So they're a very important partner in much of our work on Capitol Hill. And lastly, as a third example, the Big Cat Public Safety Act coalition, the coalition that has formed around getting that bill passed, is I would say probably around 5 to 10 organizations that are working really hard, really focused on getting the bill passed through Congress, and includes sanctuaries, big cat sanctuaries, NGOs like ours, and then we pull in others as needed and as appropriate, including law enforcement associations and agencies.
Great, thank you very much. I would like to now take us global, as they say. We're going to move on from the US and talk with Elise Stroud, our Africa Policy and Capacity Building Director. And she's going to talk about our projects in West and Central Africa and other international policy initiatives. Elise is joining us from France. She is a French lawyer specialized in international environmental and natural resources law. She has 16 years of experience leading Africa-based capacity building programs. Her current focus is developing the ability of African governments to fight wildlife crime and building consensus between African countries to conserve shared resources and implement international agreements. That's quite a big job. Thank you, Elise, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Angela. And hi, everyone. I've enjoyed so far seeing all the great comments and compliments we're already getting. It makes me feel like I'm sitting next to you talking about our work. I'm going to wait for the shared screen here. You're going to see my presentation in a moment. There we go. So, oops. There we are. This is me over here. So one of the first thing that I wanted to do is to give you a little bit of perspective on what we have accomplished over the last year and how it is going to influence our priorities for the year to come. Evidently, last year has been very challenging all around the world due to this pandemic. But from our perspective, we're very, very excited as well to have had the opportunity, despite this horrendous health situation, to be able to finalize a lot of our wildlife crime threat assessment work across West Africa, where we have completed all of our field assessment missions, and we have now gained a lot of data on illegal trade in wildlife. Again, an in-depth understanding of wildlife trafficking, the species that are targeted by wildlife trafficking, the trafficking routes, the way the networks operate. We were able to develop guidance on legislation, on the gaps that the countries are encountering with their legislation, what they need to do to strengthen their laws. And all of this guidance has been compiled in publications that are going to be made available publicly to decision makers to strengthen decision-making on wildlife crime across West Africa. So that has been very positive. Next slide, please, Karen. And this work has led to a lot of coordination in West Africa between the various governments, where countries have been really speaking with one voice and have been really linking on defining the way forward to combat wildlife trafficking. The countries have developed a strategy, the West Africa Strategy on Combating Wildlife Crime. This strategy was adopted at the ministerial level at the end of last year, and this year will be adopted by heads of states. And what that means for West Africa is that West Africa will now speak with one voice, with their clear priorities out in the open in terms of what they need to do to combat wildlife trafficking, which is a threat that needs to be combated all together. It crosses borders. And so it is very exciting to see that this has happened. And from Born Free's perspective, it is our roadmap for action. We listen to what the countries have said, and we are going to support them in implementing the actions that they have put themselves in their strategy, including by trying to find funds to implement the strategy, and also trying to set them up with the implementation mechanisms that they need to put in place to implement the West Africa strategy. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we were able to do last year is that we finalized all of our wildlife law enforcement resources. Those are the tools that we have put at the disposal of enforcement officers to allow them to do their job of combating wildlife trafficking in the field, whether you're at customs, whether you're in a park. We have launched WildScan here. You can see a little photo on the left. WildScan is a free to download phone application that facilitates the identification of species by asking you a bunch of pointed questions. And what that tool does is that it makes wildlife, the identification of species that are trafficked, much easier for enforcement officers. We have delivered a lot of trainings on WildScan, and in the year to come, we're going to expand on these trainings. We've also done quite a bit of work on outreach over the last year, developing various posters, various campaigns. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue over the next year trying to ensure that as many individuals in West Africa are informed as possible that wildlife crime, wildlife trafficking is indeed a crime and needs to be stopped, especially at the enforcement level for enforcement officers to be informed. Next slide, please. Another thing, I guess a positive note despite the pandemic, is that we have been able to continue our training all across the sub-region. You see the trainings that we've led here on your screen. The photos speak for themselves, I think, of the motivation of the countries that have guided them in trying to ensure that despite COVID-19, the trainings could still take place in the field. We have been really, really excited, despite the pandemic, to be able to continue training wildlife law enforcement officers, customs, judges and prosecutors, people in the rangers in the field even. We've been able to lead that through our remote online trainings, and then the use of the trainers that we trained previously. So that has been really, really exciting, and it speaks in itself of the commitment of the countries to receive training, but also to continue reciprocate training. And what we've started to see as well is that the trainings that we have led have started to pay off, and we've seen some seizures happen as a direct result of the trainings that have been led by our trainers or directly by our team. So that's very, very exciting, and it's an encouragement for our program in the year to come. We're going to continue expanding our trainings as much as possible, using the pool of trainers that we've already trained and supporting them in their effort, which is very, very important to try to get the momentum going and stop trafficking. Next slide, please. At the policy level now, we are very, very pleased and very excited that we've been able to launch our Global Nature Recovery Investment Initiative. I think you all are very well aware that we are now at a state of crisis for nature. We have nearly 1 million species that are facing extinction, many within decades. And it's very, very important to internationally for our organization to call for a stop for business as usual. We have been really investing a lot of time, brain power, lobbying power in trying to ensure that we call on decision makers to take bold measure for nature recovery through the various negotiations that are going to be coming up in the year to come in 2020, in this year. It's very, very important to continue this effort. The international community is currently discussing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, where the world is going to set the reference that it will follow and the objectives it will follow until 2030, 2050. And so Born Free and Born Free USA are very, very invested in ensuring that the bar is set high to ensure that we can react appropriately to the conservation crisis that we are encountering. We were able to launch our End Wildlife Crime International Initiative as well, which is of primary importance. It has two priority objectives, really. It is to try to ensure that wildlife trafficking is recognized as a transnational organized crime, the highest level of crime, which will then ensure that it can be tackled efficiently on the enforcement level. And also trying to ensure that decision-making, international regulations, take into account public health and animal health criteria, trying to ensure that we secure protection for that. And then trying to call on international commitments to reverse biodiversity loss, expand and strengthen protected areas, and commercial and wildlife exploitation and trade, ensure that communities are supported through alternative livelihood, invest in ecosystem restoration and species recovery, close wildlife markets. Those are all of the things that we consider as priority importance and things that everybody needs to prioritize, be it at the international level, but also at the country level. So if you can do the next slide, please. I think the perspective on the year to come, 2021, this year, is that we really want more of the same. Like I was saying earlier, we want to expand our trainings. And what training means is really equipping the field officers with the knowledge and the resources they need to do their job efficiently. And doing it through local authorities, equipping them to train themselves is really what we are about, trying to listen to what they are telling us. And they're telling us that they need more training, they need more support with awareness raising activities, being at the various borders, at the airport or level, the ports, the transport companies. We're going to continue investing in awareness raising. We want to continue investing in developing identification resources for field officers. One of the key challenges that West African enforcement officers have in the field is identifying what species are protected, what species are being trafficked. So we want to expand our resources with emphasis on timber, trying to ensure that we can stop illegal timber trafficking. And we want to support West African countries with their priorities, with the development of national strategies that they will have to adopt to implement the regional strategy, and helping them set up with enforcement mechanism that they need to be efficient, to be effective in their combat against wildlife crime, and also invest in public outreach and support local communities. I'm sending you here before saying goodbye. I just put a couple photos here. I saw that Jenny was actually attending this event. This is Jenny Desmond from the Liberia Chimpanzee Rescue and Protection. They're one of our key partners in Liberia. And I'm giving you this photo here as an example of how committed the people in the field are in helping and tackling wildlife crime, providing support to trying to make sure that training happens no matter what. Jenny is holding Mary Beauty here. It's a little juvenile chimp that was trafficked and that was rescued and taken care of by the Liberia Chimpanzee Rescue and Protection. She was too young when she was caught to be left alone, that she had to be cared for, she had to be nurtured. And Jenny is just holding her throughout the entire training, and you can see that little photo on Zoom here. And I just think that it is a very, very strong example that speaks for itself, both of the commitment of the people that are fighting wildlife crime every day at whatever level that it is, either be training or trying to enforce the laws or trying to rescue confiscated animals. But also it shows you the real impact that wildlife trafficking has on animals. Where you see this little chimp here, that means that the mother chimp in the entire gang has been likely killed in order to ensure that it could be captured. It just kind of show you the impact wildlife trafficking has and the importance of our work, but also of the work of the local partners and the sanctuaries that are trying to ensure that these chimps can eventually have a better life and be released into the wild. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elise. That was wonderful. I have a few questions that is related to wildlife trafficking and the pandemic, and I think some of them might be answered in our next guest's presentation. So I'd like to move on, and if you will stick around, we'll bring you back in if we have time, if for any questions that aren't addressed. So thank you, Elise. Now I'm going to bring in a man who needs no introduction, and that is Will Travers, co-founder and president of Born Free Foundation. He's also president of the Species Survival Network and has spent a lifetime advocating for wildlife protection and conservation, and was awarded the Order of the British Empire by the Queen for services to conservation and animal welfare, and is also my friend. Will, thank you for joining us.
It is such a pleasure, Angela. And I have to say, I listened to all of that incredible output, great welfare work, great legislative work, great capacity building work in Africa, great sanctuary work. I'm so thrilled and honored to be part of the whole Born Free setup. And it's amazing. We've had people from Canada and England and Scotland and Sweden and Belgium and France and all over the United States, and Liberia, of course. We've got friends on this call that we know, Alberto Frezza and Judy Baker and Eliza Marshall. I'm doing the shout out because honestly, thank you all for turning up. David Castleman, Bonnie Wiper. We have to be, the serious bit is, we just have to be this extraordinary family that delivers for wildlife. And it's down to us, because you know what? We can't really rely on anyone but ourselves to make this happen.
Ourselves and each other to tackle this. Yes.
Let's do it.
So I would like to start, Will, with really the question of the day as indicated in the name of this webinar, and just ask you, what is the current situation faced by wildlife? What is the state of the wildlife around the world?
Well, it's in pretty dire straits at the moment, Angela, and I guess we kind of all know that. We all watch stuff on TV now. We all, presumably pretty much all of us, tune in to David Attenborough, whether it's the US version or the UK version. He's now global currency. And we are being warned left, right, and center that we do not have time mess around. You know, the idea, I'll tell you this, when I started doing this work 37 years ago, I must have been a child. 37 years ago, I thought that literally we were going to be able to bring an end to the traditional exploitation of animals in zoos, which is a focus for us. I thought that would take 10 years, 15 at the out. But here we are 37 years later. I realize that we're in for the long haul on many things, but in terms of our relationship with nature, we simply don't have time. If we wait another 30 years to get to grips with the challenges that the natural world faces, we'll be out of time. So that's why we need to accelerate the process. We need to bring everyone into the tent, and we need to stop exploiting, and we actually need to start investing. And that's going to be the critical litmus test of our own survival strategy, and the survival strategy for every other species on this planet is, will we start to invest in nature instead of just taking out?
And speaking of taking out, I know you have an interesting anecdote involving a toilet seat, I believe. That would you mind telling our guests about that?
All right, spare my blushes. Well, you know, the thing is, why I tell this story is because I want you to understand who wins and who loses in this. So here's Will, Mr. Will. He goes down to the store, the hardware store, and he buys a hardwood toilet seat. It's going to be the finishing touch to that small room in the house. And I pay $100 for it. And the hardware store has bought it from the wholesaler, and they've paid $60 for it. The wholesaler has bought it from the importer, and they've paid $40 for it. And the importer has bought it from the shipper, and they paid $30 for it. And the shipper bought it from the sawmill as rough timber for $20, and the sawmill bought it from the roadhead, from the guy who cuts down the tree for $10. All the way along that supply chain, there has been value. Everybody has made something on this piece of wood that comes from the forest. And you have to ask yourself the question, who has not gained anything? Who has lost in this? And the answer is, it's the tree. The tree and the environment that tree lived in, the home that it provided for thousands of individual other animals, for maybe hundreds of different species, for the microclimate that it provided as well, for its contribution to dealing with carbon that we are pumping into the atmosphere. That is the kind of exploitation that I am so appalled by, because it's all about taking. And nobody is thinking, not enough people are thinking about putting back, about investing. So that is my toilet seat story. And I would encourage you, if you remember it, and that's why I chose the toilet seat, just in case you do, I would encourage you to tell that story to people you know.
So, Will, instead of taking, how do we invest? You know, what do you mean by investing in nature? And what is this going to cost?
Okay, well, I'll just give you kind of two numbers, really. The first is that the cost in the last year, the cost to the world, just in financial terms, of dealing with the pandemic has been in the order of 24 trillion US dollars. 24 trillion US dollars. The cost of investing in nature to provide the resources that nature needs to thrive and survive has been estimated to be around $600 billion. Now, that's still a lot of money, but compare it to the amount of money that we have thrown at, and quite rightly in a sense, thrown at trying to deal with the devastation of COVID-19, the devastation to lives, the devastation to livelihoods, all of that. I understand why it's done. We still have to keep doing it. We still have to keep looking after each other. But now we have to think about looking after the planet that provides us with the air we breathe, the water that we drink, the resources that we rely on. And another thing that you should be aware of, Angela, and that is there is a thing called Earth Overshoot Day. Earth Overshoot Day is a day in the year, it moves around, when the resources that the Earth has produced are used up. It's like the interest on a bank account. You know, you invest some money, you spend the interest, but if you're not careful, you start to spend the capital. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what's happening with Earth Overshoot Day. And in 2020, Earth Overshoot Day was the 22nd of August. So it means that up until the 22nd of August, we were living off the interest. After that day, we were living off the capital. And that day is creeping earlier and earlier and earlier. And it will be a reality, if we do not change our ways, that we will be living off the capital from day one. And that will be the end of the world as we know it.
Well, and once you start depleting the capital, you earn less interest. It's just a vicious cycle that's going to, you know, keep depleting until we're down to nothing. So,
indeed.
Yes, well, yes. I'd like to go to a couple of our audience questions.
Sure.
And I'd like to invite Elise back, because some of these may be touching on her work as well. So either one of you, please jump in. Has the pandemic invigorated your efforts in that there's greater recognition of the human health risks from wildlife trafficking?
Go, Alice. Go,
okay.
Alice.
Do something further field really quick. It has really been positive. Well, it has helped a lot of high-level decision makers to bring more attention to the issue of wildlife trafficking in West Africa and trying to entice collaboration between the field environmental officers and environment ministry and the public health ministries, and that dialogue, at least from a field perspective, has been very, very positive. Will, sorry for barging in before.
No, I think it's an important point to make. I think that you know, we still haven't quite articulated the message strongly enough about this incredibly close relationship between the exploitation of nature and animals that almost certainly has contributed significantly to the pandemic. And to help people understand that, Angela, you know that we've just launched, and when I say just, I mean in the last 48 hours, we have launched a new short film, narrated, for those who know who this person is, by the wonderful Joanna Lumley, and it's only 3.5 minutes long. It's beautifully made. It's extremely serious, but it is very accessible. It really explains in very straightforward terms. There's a line in it that I think sums it up. You know, she says, what was the cause of COVID-19, the pandemic? Was it a bat? Was it a pangolin? No, it was us. And that's the truth. We have been the instigator of this situation because we have abused and used and got into far too up close and personal with the natural world in a way that kind of was never intended. So it is our responsibility to fix it, and fixing it will require that investment that I talked about, and also an entirely different mindset about how you interact with the natural world and how you use the resources that are we're so blessed with. We're so lucky to be able to have those resources. Not all of us by any means. Many of the people in the countries where Alice works live on a fraction. You know, people say, oh, there's too many people. Well, you know, one could argue that there are too many people, but one could also argue that on average, every American citizen is going to use 6 times the natural resources of an Indian citizen during their life. If it's the UK, it's about 4.5 times the resources of an Indian citizen during their life. So it's not just about raw numbers of people. It is about the resources that they use to sustain the lifestyles that they have become accustomed to.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a somewhat related question, and I'm going to pose this first for Elise. And Jen, if you'd like to pop back on, you might have something you'd like to add to it as well. This is a question, again, regarding zoonotic diseases, and talking about preventing the sorry, goodness, I just lost that. I just lost the question. But it's preventing zoonotic diseases and what we're doing about that. I know that, Jen, there is a bill in Congress that you've been looking at and exploring. So actually, maybe I'll start with you and then we can pop over to Elise.
Sure. So I believe the question was over the international context. What are we doing globally in terms of preventing future pandemics? So I'll give my little piece and then hand it over to Elise, who I know has been doing a lot of work on this. But right at the top of the year, I think on January 4th, right after the new Congress gavelled into session, a bipartisan group of congressmen and senators reintroduced actually the Preventing Future Pandemics Act of 2021. And there is a huge swath of organizations that have been working on this bill and that support this bill. This is another one of those really large NGO coalitions putting their oomph behind this bill. What the bill does is for the US, it prohibits the import, export, and sale of live wildlife for the purpose of human consumption as food or medicine, and it closes all wildlife markets for that purpose within the United States. It's a bipartisan bill. It was introduced by Mike Quigley and Fred Upton in the House and Senators John Cornyn and Cory Booker in the Senate. The bill itself does recognize that a global approach is needed. A global approach to emerging diseases and the threats they pose. And it places the US in a strong position to be a leader in that fight. But specifically, the legislation requires a study on how consuming wildlife as food or medicine increases the risk of zoonotic diseases. It provides funding to the US Agency for International Development, or USAID, to help communities that rely on consumption of wildlife for food security to develop and transition alternative sources of protein, directs the United States to engage the global community, develop a diplomatic consensus on the need to shut down live wildlife markets and commercial trade across the world. And then it does those other things that I mentioned at the top. So the US, the Congress is firmly aware that this is an international problem with an international solutions. Cooperation, diplomacy is needed. And I can think of no better segue to hand it over to Elise.
Thank you, Jen. But I think just to add perspective, this is really where the Global Nature Recovery Investment Initiative was born from, because as Will pointed out earlier in his insights, it is very clear that we are the cause of this zoonotic problem, this zoonotic disease problem, by increasing contacts between wild animals and human, being by reducing protected areas, encroaching on habitats, or through wildlife markets. And so one of the purposes of the wildlife, of the investment initiative, Nature Investment Initiative, is to ensure that we can advocate in favor of an expansion of protected areas, restoring ecosystem to bring them back to their pristine condition, and then ensuring that within the international community, the rules that are governing the international trade in wildlife are adapted to ensure that public health is properly taken into account. And then at the domestic level, ensuring that wildlife markets are closed because they cause a significant risk, a significant public health risk, in addition to, of course, the animal welfare concerns that we have about those markets. So those are really a brief highlight of what we've been working on. The Nature Investment Initiative has really been born out of a desire, a response to the extinction crisis, but a desire to ensure that the response to the pandemic take into account the fact that we caused it in the first place by encroaching upon nature. That would be my response. Thank you for the good question.
Thank you. Will, do you have anything else to add? I have one last question for you, but if you would like to comment on that further before we move on.
Not so much on that, Angela, and I'm sorry, and I don't know what your question is, because we have not swapped notes before. But what I will say is that listening to Jen and to Alice and to Liz, and to all the contributions and reading all the contributions that have been made in the chat and the questions that have been answered, you know, as I said before, it is in our hand, it is in our gift to address these issues. And we are, if necessary, the pebble that goes into the pond and sends those ripples out by talking to our friends, talking to our family, talking to our colleagues at work, talking to our legislators, talking to our companies, the people we buy stuff from, to encourage them to be more sensitive to the environment, to be more sustainable, to change the way they do business, because they only do business because we buy stuff. So we have cumulatively huge power to do that. And I will say, you know, if people watching this, and I noticed that we've had, you know, hundreds of people tuned in to watch this evening. If you want to help, if you want to assist, and I know many of you do, if you want to help that campaign work, that policy work, that sanctuary work, that welfare work, then do consider making a contribution. Do adopt one of the primates. I know many of you have. I've seen those come up. Do adopt a primate down there. And by the way, if you happen to have a couple of 4x4 pickups in good condition lying around that you don't need anymore because you're downsizing to an electric vehicle, then we do need those pickups down at the sanctuary, because we can't run that nearly 200-acre property and look after the 430 plus animals on it with our tiny but fantastic team without vehicles. So seriously, if you happen to know someone who is jettisoning their prized SUV, pickup, 4x4 Dodge, then you know where to call.
Thank you, Will. You actually, as you often do, read my mind. I was going to ask you what individuals can do to make a positive difference, and you've answered that very well. Is be the pebble, you know, that starts the ripple, and also support organizations that have the expertise that, like Born Free USA, to really get in and solve these problems. So,
Angela, I will just say, the monetary side, the financial support is hugely appreciated, but we can all do something as well, and that is we can look around us at our environment and we can decide to do one thing. If you live in an apartment and all you have is a window box or a tiny little patch out the front, or if you live near a park, or if you have a larger piece of land, think about that as a habitat for wildlife and make it as wildlife friendly as you possibly can.
Great. Thank you, Will. I know we could talk for hours more, and we did not get to all the questions that we had, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email us at info@bornfreeusa.org and help us, you know, stand up for nature. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with a recording to this, along with some actions that you can take, including viewing the Protect Us, Protect Them video that Will had mentioned. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye-bye.